Well, it's my pleasure to be able to give a final presentation on my research brief. On the screen, you can see that my question, do professional learning communities impact student achievement, was the question I chose to answer through my research. I will start by telling you there is a plethora of resources out there as far as research, books, and scholarly articles about professional learning communities. I'd narrowed my search to specifically target education and specifically over the last 10 years. So I want to start out with what is a PLC. I think in order to fully understand the direction of the research brief, I needed to define what is a professional learning community. The definition I came up with for a professional learning community is that the members are grouped by similar responsibilities like grade level or content. That's obviously going to be determined by the size of your district. A district like Omaha Public Schools, you're going to have a building level PLC. And if we use a middle school, for example, you might have several seventh grade PLCs, or you might even have a social studies or a science individual PLC. In a district like Shelby Rising City Schools, our PLCs are in fact both grade level and content. And so you'll see in the research that they need to have similar responsibilities. An example, in a small school like ours, our K-1-2 teachers are a PLC. Now, they meet regularly with dedicated and structured time. I think that's a very important definition of a PLC. Regularly leaves a lot to be interpreted. Throughout the research, I found a lot of different definitions for regularly. Structured time means that there's a certain allotment of time set aside, and we'll get a little bit further into what structured actually means. PLCs adhere to operating norms and member roles. PLCs should have norms or rules or guidelines that they follow for behaviors inside the group. And there are some key roles that I'll focus on a little bit later that need to be instituted for it to truly be a professional learning community. There needs to be a collaborative focus. That obviously is the main purpose of a professional learning community. And that collaborative focus should be on three things: discussing student learning, reflecting on instructional practice and assessment, and engaging in problem solving. There may be other uses for professional learning communities. I would say consistently throughout my reading, those three areas continually came up as a main purpose. Professional learning communities need to utilize data to support results. So professional learning communities are data-oriented and data-driven. And last, you'll notice I mentioned structured time above. Professional learning communities need to operate with an agenda. So as you can see on the screen, that would be a consensus definition of a professional learning community. There's no question that Richard DeFore has had a tremendous impact on how we view professional learning communities in the education area. Richard DeFore is a leading researcher. In fact, if you have seen anything from Solution Tree, it is completely aligned to Richard DeFore's research. And has a lot of resources that support how he has shaped the vision for a PLC. Richard DeFore's 4 critical questions really helped establish a framework for professional learning communities. And those 4 critical questions are: what do students need to know and be able to do? How will we know when they have learned it? What will we do when they haven't learned it? And what will we do when they already know it? These 4 critical questions are the foundation of an educational professional learning community. They should be what's helping center the conversation to helping the greater good. Through these 4 critical questions, you're talking about a broader scope of impacting student success through instruction and assessment, rather than talking about individual students' needs. Richard DeFore also believes collaboration is critical to student success. And I think that throughout the research, 30 plus articles, the word collaboration comes up every single time. And you will see, as I found in my research brief, Some of the studies even pointed to the fact that collaboration was more impactful on student success than the formal PLC process being followed. Richard DeFore believes PLCs are an ongoing process in which educators work collaboratively in reoccurring cycles of collective inquiry and action research to achieve better results for the students they serve. I wanted to share that part from Richard DeFore's impact. That's not something you will see in my research brief. I had a difficult time basically using one person's definition to define or articulate how a PLC should look. I've used that exact quote in working with my staff here at Shelby Rising City because I believe in it. That's the essence we're trying to establish through our PLCs. What makes PLCs impactful? Basically the framework variables. And when I say variables, in that if we simply followed the definition that I had in an earlier slide, and we followed DeFore's 4 critical questions, you're going to have a successful PLC. When we talk about impactful, I'm using that term because how do you get the most out of the PLC? How do you ensure that it's truly impacting student achievement? And these were some of the variables that came up consistently throughout research where it led to student improvement and higher student achievement in the schools or the testing of the theory. So feedback from colleagues on instructional practices. When that's incorporated into your PLC and the colleagues have a way to influence and or discuss the successes and failures of instructional practices, it tended to have a higher impact on what's going on in the individual classrooms, and the best instructional practices tended to rise to the top. And we know there's a connection between sound instructional practices and student achievement. PLCs that use SMART goals were found to have quite a bit of success in impacting student achievement and changing instructional strategies of the teachers. And we all know that SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So those, when incorporated into the PLCs, were very impactful. Format to increase professional knowledge and enhance student learning. Basically, the format of the PLC became the mechanism used for peers to learn from each other and to bring different research to the table to discuss what was successful or, again, not really working in the classroom. And this mechanism creates two other things. It creates an openness to learning pedagogical interventions and safe to admit limited content knowledge. And so we see that PLCs that have a culture of collaboration and a culture of trust become a mechanism for both the interventions and being a safe place for teachers to admit they need help. Risk-taking and experimentation with instruction, when that's part of the conversation, and documentation. And again, we talk about data. When teachers used data to discuss about using new instructional strategies or new assessments, how that impacted student achievement, it encouraged their peers in the PLCs to take more risks and be willing to experiment. I believe in my reading that part of that is they felt safe in a PLC that those 2 or 3 people or 4 or 5 people in the group were going to support them whether they were successful or whether they failed, and they had a peer group to count on for support. PLCs were reflection, inquiry, and action directly related to instruction and student learning were the focus. Obviously led to higher areas of higher student achievement, led to higher levels of teacher efficacy in the support of PLCs. So those are variables that need to be a part of a successful PLC. PLCs that met more often than once a week led to a higher rate of instructional changes. If you look at the formats for PLCs, how often they meet, very different. Looking at the Metro, I noticed there's a lot of them that meet once a week or once a month. And it led all the way down to those that meet twice a week, some that meet daily, in some rural or other areas in the research. I thought it was interesting that when they met more than once a week, it led to a higher rate of instructional change. I believe that to be the case because it provides for more ready feedback. We talk about the importance of students getting timely feedback. I think the same can be applied to instructional changes for our teachers. The others results should be tracked over a 3 to 5 year window. The PLCs that invested that length of time, they were able to track results, make tweaks or changes, and saw higher levels of teacher instructional changes and student achievement. So, what are the roles and norms? I talked earlier in the definition. What do you need to have for a successful PLC to impact student learning? The two key roles that come up are facilitator and recorder. The facilitator is the person who is going to run your groups. That's a key role, and they're needing knowledge of pedagogy in order to guide meaningful collegial inquiry is a must, and there needs to be training. That was found time and time again to be two key things for facilitator success. The other role is recorder. Since data is a part of PLCs, the recorder recording what was discussed or talked about, following a set agenda, gave insight that could not only be reviewed by that PLC group, but sharing and collaboration among PLCs in a building or a district was found to be much more successful when PLCs had a recorder. Norms, which are basically your operational rules or guidelines, operating norms that support respect, trust, and confidentiality are very important. And what groups used as norms varied throughout the research, but they should be centered on basically creating respect, trust, and confidentiality. Norms are used to assist in creating an environment of collaboration and professional learning. So, for example, things like showing up prepared, keeping conversations confidential, providing additional resources, being open to what you're talking about, not being judgmental, allowing everybody to be a contributing member of the PLC, were just a couple specific examples that I noticed in the research that all led to higher teacher efficacy. I believe the higher rate of teacher efficacy is going to lead to a higher rate of buy-in, which is going to lead to doing things to a higher level of fidelity. And of course, we're going to see in the next slide what did PLCs do that actually impacted student achievement? And number one is implementation to fidelity. So if we go back to the definition of PLCs, when it's implemented to fidelity, when all these key variables are followed, those PLCs were impactful in student achievement. They were impactful through changing instruction and through changing assessment. And so the norms need to support assisting the teachers in implementing it to fidelity. Leadership that promotes a culture of support, whether that's district level leadership or building level leadership, they need to be supportive. Shared leadership comes up often in the talk of successful PLCs. Teachers that felt micromanaged or forced to discuss specific things in PLCs had lower levels of efficacy than ones that felt they had shared leadership, who could take results from PLC conversation and data to leadership, where it became an avenue for instructional and assessment type changes within the district. That's where you saw more support from leaders. The focus is on student learning. And the PLCs that focus specifically on the aspects of student learning and the things that directly impact student learning, curriculum assessment and instruction on a broader scale, were found to have more impact on student achievement. Conversation there is that PLCs are put in place to help a broader scope of helping student achievement. We all know that districts have, through the MTSS process, SAT, 504, and a myriad of other interventions for individual and specific students. Those processes are not replaced through PLCs because that's where that work is done. Working on the greater number of students is done through the PLCs. Teacher efficacy leads to instructional changes. I think I've talked about that throughout the presentation, and it makes sense. If teachers believe in what's going on, buy into what's going on, feel supported, have that peer support group, you're going to see a more willingness to make changes in instruction. PLCs and impacted student achievement are ones that felt an empowerment to change pedagogy. I think that's also very important. If teachers feel that they can't make those type of changes because they won't have the support of their principal, it's not going to happen. So PLCs, where they know they have that power, that shared leadership to make those changes, they saw higher rates of student achievement in those specific areas. There was a great example of a study done with specifically to middle school math students. And in the PLC, they made some pedagogical changes in how they taught math in this middle school. They were in contrast to recommended best practices in the district. Through the support of the principal and through the district leadership, they were given an opportunity to make changes so they could use the data to gauge if it was impactful. The students had the highest levels of achievement since the formal testing had gone on in this school. That then led to some changes district-wide. I think that was the best example I saw in the research of how that empowerment can be impactful. There needs to be a constructionist approach, which means working in harmony with your peers on strategies that can be implemented consistently across teams, buildings, and districts. The self-initiating learners working in concert with their peers will lead to a willingness of the teachers to experiment with new instructional strategies and assessments. And so a constructionist approach is so key. And I've talked about it already with shared leadership. PLCs are not going to be successful in impacting student leadership unless the district leadership is willing to be shared with the teachers in those PLCs. I wanted to kind of wrap up a little bit with a quote from Richard DeFore before I kind of talk about my findings. Richard DeFore's comment on creating a collaborative culture is the single most important factor in school improvement for those seeking to enhance the effectiveness of teaching and learning. And I think this quote is indicative of why a district would consider a professional learning community format and why they would look at implementing PLCs. I know that that quote right there is a great summation of why we're choosing to do it at Shelby Rising City Schools. So my findings through the research is that when PLCs are implemented consistently, supported by administration, and focused on instructional practices, there is a correlation to improved student achievement. I would say additional findings of a 2008 study by Ross Vicio concluded that PLCs are not what impacts changes to student achievement, but teachers who focus on student learning do. And so again, going back, the PLC is not the solution to improving student achievement. A properly implemented and supported PLC, where teachers are focused on student learning, will absolutely impact student achievement. I've enjoyed researching this. There's going to be a lot of usefulness for me as the superintendent at Shelby Rising City Schools because we have adopted the PLC format. And I know that this research has allowed me to keep us focused on specific aspects of our PLCs that we know will help us in impacting student achievement. I've enjoyed the class. I appreciated getting to know everybody and feel like I've learned as much just sharing with all of you as I have in doing the research. If you have any questions about anything from my research brief, do not hesitate to get a hold of me.